I frequently have to look up the difference between accountable and responsible.
What's your kind of view, Jenny, of like when we should be using a RACI?
A healthy product team is never going to turn towards a RACI. AI is getting in the way of relationships because you sort of use AI and you write up your memo. RACI is great if it's encouraging the conversations, if it's about building the relationships between people. Everything I do is the product mindset. I guess my final piece of advice is have low expectations.
Hey, it's the Product Experience, and I'm Lily Smith.
And I'm Randy Silver. This week, we're talking to Jenny Wanger, Product Ops Consultant and Reforge Instructor, about why RACI is just plain wrong.
That sounds awesome. And her newsletter, The Next Iteration, is a must-read. It contains systems, process, and guidance on how to operate like a top product team. Jenny wrote a great blog post on RACI that sparked a lively conversation on LinkedIn, so we just had to invite her in to do a deep dive. Hi, Jenny. Welcome to the Product Experience. It's great to be talking to you today.
Hello, it's really exciting to be here.
So thank you so much for joining us. We're going to be talking about RACIs today and having, I think you just said it was going to be a RACI conversation.
I
I'll
love
steal
a good
that
pun.
thunder and get that in there before you do. But before we have our RACI conversation, it would be great if you could give our listeners a real quick intro to who you are and what you do in product and how you got to where you are.
Yeah, totally. I'm a product operations coach, consultant, and instructor, which really means that I'm helping product leaders who are trying to get the best performance out of their team, and to do that by putting the right infrastructure in place that actually allows the team to thrive. So what this looks like in practice is I do a lot of work with product teams going through major transitions, whether acquisitions, mergers, turnarounds, most frequently, in order to just try and put the right pieces in place that make it easier for everybody to start working as one team, to collaborate better, deliver more valuable products to their customers. And I got into product the roundabout way, as most everybody does. I was actually an events coordinator originally, and running events, right, was one of these things where I was constantly having to take user feedback and design new ways for people to interact and make sure that everybody could essentially navigate these events without having to ask for help, right? Without documentation, as it were. So it turned out I was building these very physical experiences where everybody had to know what was going on and find their way around and navigate. And since then, I ended up learning that there was a role where I could do that digitally in product management. And I have been doing that for many years, ended up in product leadership, where I found myself mostly doing operational work. And then years later, discovered that product operations was actually a word, and that was what I had been doing all of those years. And so here I am now doing that all the time.
So before we get stuck into why we're talking about RACIs tonight, it would be great if you could give us a quick sort of recap of what a RACI is and why people tend to use them.
Yeah. So RACI is an acronym, RACI, and it stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. And they're often called RACI matrices or RACI charts. And the whole idea is that you create a chart where you lay out everybody who's working on something, and you say who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, who's informed. And you tick or you X out particular boxes accordingly until you know what everybody is supposed to be doing. And they are used when people are confused about who's doing what, right? They are when you want to just provide some clarity on what everybody's roles and responsibilities might be.
And I think the first time I came across them, I think it was when I was doing Prince 2 training, like project management training, like probably about 25 years ago. And then I hadn't heard of them for ages. And then one of the companies that I worked in recently, they were like, everyone's a bit confused. People are kind of trying to work on, like, do the same things and do the same jobs. Like, let's do a RACI and we can bring a bit of clarity to everything, which seemed like a great idea. And it worked quite well, actually, for us. And so I was really curious to talk to you about this, because I think you have a very specific case where a RACI should be used, and then in other circumstances, different things should be used. So talk us through that and kind of why we're talking about RACIs today.
Yeah. So as I said, and you're totally right, Lily. RACI has, it's taught as a best practice in many, especially project management environments. It actually goes all the way back to, right, it comes out of sort of 1950s management theory, where with this like, oh, well, let's take all the best practices of the factory and we're going to move them into the office. And everybody, we're going to get all that productivity into knowledge work and it's going to be great. And it was like cutting edge management theory in 1950. And it makes sense, right? People don't like hanging out in ambiguity. They say, just tell me what to do, right? It's easier, it's more comfortable. And it's seen as a solution often to solve tension between various people where there's this like, well, what am I supposed to do? What are you supposed to do? I don't know. What are you supposed to do? Right. Thing is like it doesn't actually work for those things. So the challenge is, especially once you get into product teams, that it's no longer productive towards the kind of collaboration that we actually want on a product team. Because RACI ends up causing a couple of key issues. One is that it actually, despite the fact that there's an A in there for accountable, it actually leads to everybody who's not the A being like, oh, I'm not accountable. Anything this team does, like, that's the accountable person's decision. I'm just a cog in the machine. And it's almost like a high school group project where, it's sort of like, okay, I can just coast on I'll coast on the responsible and the accountable of people's work. It removes responsibility by definition, which is not the kind of mindset that we want on a product team. The second thing is that I really see it as infantilizing people where, oh, I'm sorry, yeah, we need to tell you what you should be doing with your job, right? We need to lay it out for you. Or right, it's because I hate to break, but it's never the whole team that's like, yeah, what we need is a RACI. It's usually one person or a couple of people who are like, well, if those people knew what to do, then we would be working so much better together, right? And so I think that as a healthy product team, it shouldn't be that you're being told what your level of involvement should be on the product team, right? It should be that you are working with the team as a peer. And so with that, right, the other side of the infantilization is the territorialism, where it creates an environment where somebody says, well, this is my job, please don't do my job. And especially right in an environment we're in right now, or one of the companies I worked with that was where the leadership was asking pretty frequently for a RACI had gone through, frankly, a lot of restructurings and layoffs. And I think that there was this concern, there was this fear of, well, I need to have my job well defined so that I can keep my job, right? If nobody knows what I do, if it's not well laid out here, then maybe I'm going to be laid off. And so there's this desire to protect their jobs and put in almost, create a barrier around it that couldn't be somebody else's job in order to make sure that they felt that sense of job security. But the territorialism is, again, not what a healthy product team looks like. That's not collaboration. And that goes all the way back to that factory mindset, right? Of, in a factory, okay, I'll put the buttons on and you sew the seams and this person will cut the fabric and, probably not in that order. Clearly, I don't work in a factory making jackets. But the idea of I've got my job and you've got your job, it makes much more sense in that kind of environment. But when you're trying to do something creative that's never been done before, that's exactly the opposite of the kind of culture you should be trying to build.
So, Jenny, my problem with it is much more stupid. Let's put it that way, because there's only one accountable person. There are multiple responsible people and beyond. So it really shouldn't be a RACI. It should be an ARCI if you want to do it by hierarchy. But that, like I said, that is a really stupid reason to hate the whole thing. There is a more serious.
No, I'm going to yes and that a little bit too, because the other thing is, as I've been digging into it, and I'll admit this for myself. I frequently have to look up the difference between accountable and responsible, because as far as I know, those words kind of sound like they mean the same thing. but in the RACI framework, they mean different things. So there's a whole, language issue around it too, where it's meant to add clarity, but first you have to look up the definitions so that you can get the clarity. Like it's, that part as well is quite foolish.
And actually, my biggest problem is the C, it's the consulted, because everybody and their neighbor wants to be consulted before the responsible people or the people who are actually working on something make a decision. Everyone thinks they're too important, that every other team in the world has to check in with them first. So this is really just a territorial bun fight when you put these together, isn't it?
Absolutely, right? So yeah, you end up with not only territorialism between individuals, but it's encouraging political jockeying within your company, which I don't know any company that says, yes, we need more politics.
But hang on, because I'm on the slightly pro-RACI side. Because I think what it does is it starts a conversation about different people's expectations of their involvement. And Randy, to your point, if everyone wants to be consulted, then you can have that conversation and be like, okay, well, if we're going to consult you all, that's going to take so much time. So are you sure? Can we not just have you being informed instead? So I do think it's a very simple and easy to understand framework for when you want to get clarity and have that conversation. But I also agree with you, Jenny, being too fixed in your mindset of how you use it can be constraining, and also can totally appreciate the territorialism and the infantilization. But did I say that right?
But then why not just ask people and have a conversation with them about their level of involvement, right? The instant that you if you're bringing the framework into it, all of a sudden, it makes it feel more rigid. It makes it feel like a much harder thing to change later. And so if the goal is to have the conversation with people about being consulted or not, and probably, right, there's a much more nuanced conversation to be had, which is, what do you want to be consulted on, right? The architect probably does not need to be consulted on the marketing copy. The fill in the blank of, a RACI can almost, because people tend to just sort of tick and X off the boxes, it can end up that you've got this whole list of people who are all saying they want to be consulted on everything. And it can absolutely then, if when that happens, right, and that's when RACI gets abused, it absolutely derails the product team and can slow any initiative to an absolute standstill.
Jenny, there's I'm not sure if you've come across Emily Weber's Team Onion, which does exactly what you said, which is based on how much involvement you want in a program or a decision, you have to dedicate more of your availability, more of your time to it. So you can't demand to be consulted, but say, I'm barely available to this. If this is really important to you, you're becoming part of the team in some way. And I always thought that was an interesting way of doing it. But I agree, this is a good way of starting a conversation, just not of solving it.
And the other thing that this really reminds me of is, the classic sort of storming, forming, norming, the processes that teams go through, or the states that teams go through when they change. And when a RACI can be helpful in that sort of storming situation where you've changed the structure of a team or you've changed its dynamic in some way and everyone's just trying to understand everything. What's your kind of view, Jenny, of when we should be using a RACI?
I think that the times when you could be using a RACI, I look at it as being useful when it is a time-boxed, scope-limited project of people who don't frequently work together. To me, that is sort of the optimal situation in which introducing a RACI can be helpful. Even then, I will ask, is there not a better framework that's come about in the past 50 or so years it's more decision focused, right? So there are ones like RAPID is a popular one, where at least you then don't end up with the confusion about what all the letters mean, or what all the words mean within the framework. And if you can use something that's a little bit more clear about this being around who's making what decisions and when, have that conversation on your scope limited, time limited project team, right? And especially when you're not working with people you're familiar with, right? When you're working with a different department or a different area of the organization that you're not used to working with, then it can be a great tool and conversation starter to jumpstart all of that. The concern I have is when I see it being used across product teams, what should engineering do? What should design be responsible for? Places where it's supposed to be a very deep, long-term relationship of people actually collaborating deeply. That's where putting that RACI in place derails the initiative instead of supporting it moving forward.
Can you talk a tiny bit more about RAPID? So it's only because we discussed this ahead of time, or you wrote about in your article, and I looked it up. So it's recommend, agree, perform, input, and decide. What exactly does that mean? Why is it better than RACI for this?
There are a bunch of other decision-making frameworks out there, whether you look at RAPID, you look at DARE, right? One is that they're mostly designed to not have that linguistic confusion around what do these words actually mean. But second is that they're very concentrated around who is responsible for making the decision, not who is responsible for the outcomes of the initiative overall, right? And so it, again, it focuses the team around, okay, this decision perhaps is we need to figure out a new analytics platform to purchase. And so there's going to be a couple people who can recommend on something. These will be the people, who actually do the research or who are going to do the POC and figure out if this is going to work. They're going to check in with IT for a security review. And then this is the person who decides. And when it's right back to that's a time box, scope limited decision that needs to be made. And so for things like that, it can be useful, but making sure that it's clear this is not about, your job, right? That's another thing that happens with RACI, frankly, is people start to turn it into, they sort of take the job description and turn it into the RACI, or take the RACI and turn it into the job description. And that's not what's going on in these projects, right? This is about making a decision and acting upon it. And so having the clarity to be that we're making it clear that this is not supposed to be something that will define you as a person, right? Back to that idea of empowering people, not infantilizing them, and avoiding territorialism, right? Having it be very clearly a decision-making framework is one of the tools that you can use to avoid that.
That's a surprise to me that people are using RACI within product teams to kind of define like who does what in a product team. Like, how are people getting into that situation where they need to use RACI to define who's responsible for what? And, what are those root causes?
Yeah. So, I'll talk one client that I worked with. I had this VP of engineering, and every time we met, there was this little offhand thing about, oh, if we just had a RACI, right? If we, this, and then he'd say, it'd be great for us to have a RACI. And he was really looking at me and being like, Jenny, you're supposed to be helping our team work together better. Like, where's our RACI so that we all know what we're supposed to be doing? What was actually going on here is that he and the director of product were not working towards the same vision. And so they were getting into territorial battles over the roadmap. And it ended up in the situation where the VP actually would be the owner of the roadmap, and the director of product, the product person, was saying, here are the initiatives I want to work on. And then the engineering lead was deciding whether or not those would be worked on or not. I see your eyes bulging out of your head. Yes, it was not a healthy situation. And there they were trying to use RACI, right, as a controlling tool. And so when I look at a lot of the times where RACI is being asked for, right? There's actually collaboration issues that need to be solved. So yeah, a healthy product team is never going to turn towards a RACI, and because they're going to look at that and they're going to, they're going to say, what, are you absurd? Like, of course we know what an engineer is supposed to do or a designer is supposed to do. But when collaboration friction starts to show up, it often can lead to some of this more territorial behavior, some of these negative patterns. And a lot of times what I see is that they're asking for RACI to paper over more fundamental issues of collaboration. So team structure challenges, right? Sometimes nobody ends up doing something on a team because everybody's like, well, I'm not very good at that, so I'm not going to do it. But it turns out that nobody is very good at that. And so, is it better to have somebody to do it and for them to jump in and be a little bit out of their comfort zone? Or maybe it's a sign that they need to bring somebody in to help and fill that gap, right? But do we have the right people in place, and do they feel like they can do the task at hand? And then also, right, with that team structure, are they actually talking to each other versus are they sort of going up the ladder to their manager, and then the managers are talking and the words are coming back down the other side? So team structure challenges is one of the things I see a ton when RACI is getting asked for. Mission clarity is another, right? With this engineering leader and the product leader, they didn't have this alignment around the same vision. And so that's why this roadmap ended up being this territorial battle between the two of them, because they were trying to both take the product in different directions. And if you don't have clarity on what the mission is, then of course it's going to be very hard for the whole team to figure out what everybody should be doing in service of that mission. And then the final thing is a lot of these places I work with where RACIs are being asked for, there's a handoff mentality, right? Back again to that factory mindset of, and this was actually another thing that was going on, right, with this engineering leader and director of product, where it was that handoff of, okay, you hand off to me what your feature requests are for the roadmap. And we'll put aside the fact that the factory mindset went so far that they had features as the key thing they were handing off to each other, right? Talk about a feature factory. But you've got you've got this thing of, give me your requests, I will evaluate them, I will decide, and then we will queue this up for the engineers. And no, please don't go, product person, please don't go talk to the engineers on my team, right? So you've got this team structure issue going on, you've got this mission clarity issue, and then you've got the handoffs all happening at once. And so of course he's clamoring for a RACI, because it's the kind of situation where he sees like, okay, if only everybody knew how to do their jobs, if only everybody knew what their job was, then all of our problems would be solved. And so it's usually not a sign of a healthy product organization.
So Jenny, that sounds like a really interesting case study. And also, actually, now that you say it like this, I can totally imagine like other product teams acting with this sort of kind of dysfunction. Just with the people that I know and have spoken to who work in products, it doesn't sound actually that dissimilar from the way that other people are working. But I'm really, really curious to know, did you manage to solve this problem with this team, and how did you do it?
So not entirely, right? There were some underlying issues at the company that were coming from elsewhere, where I wasn't going to be able to fix everything. But I did hold strong that no, I was not going to just produce a RACI and expect that would fix everything, because obviously with those being the underlying issues, documenting everybody's roles was not going to do much. But I did work on several things with that team. One was really forcing them to move forward with a clear product strategy that was written down. It was one of those situations where, lo and behold, as I talked to different people, everybody had a sense of product strategy, but it was in their heads. And so it wasn't getting lined up and it wasn't matching. And so then, of course, there's these tensions around the roadmap, right? So it was, first, let's actually get a strategy in place, and that solves that mission clarity. The second thing was really working with the engineering leader to loosen up his fear of engineers being talked to, and let the product leader actually communicate directly with the engineers. And so That's addressing the team structure challenges, right? So making it so there's not this game of telephone anymore, that things can start to move a little bit more quickly, and that people feel more like they're on a team together. So you've got mission clarity and the team structure challenges happening together. The actual changing the process around the road mapping, that was something that we were working on. That was in many ways, that was the hardest item to touch because it had so much power and politics around it. And so that was the one where I don't think I got as far as I wanted to on that before I had to, the challenges of a consultant is eventually you have to leave the client.
I can very much empathize with that. I had a client recently, a few months back, where they were going through a transformation, and it was the entire product and engineering team who essentially asked for a RACI. And the CPO or CPTO there didn't really want them to do it. And what we ultimately settled on is we were going to an offsite. We were fine with the team doing it ahead of time and having the conversations, and we encouraged them to spend the time having the conversations to help illustrate where the problems and where the confusion lied. But then when we got up at the offsite, we physically threw the RACI away. I said, great, you've had the point of the RACI discussion, you've had that. We understand where the confusion is. So we'll talk in a very general sense about how this is supposed to work in theory, and recognize that every single team is going to work differently. And it's up to you to figure out how to make it work. And if you have problems, either work it out yourselves or come and raise it up to the next level, and we'll discuss how to fix it. And it was a really interesting conversation because, the RACI was a useful exercise just to set the tone of discovery, but not for solving the problem at all.
That is a good use of RACI, right? And one of the things I posted about this topic on LinkedIn as well, and got a tremendous number of responses. Apparently, I'm not the only one who feels very strongly about RACI. Usually what ends up happening is exactly the opposite of that, where a lot of work is put into the RACI. They try to make it just right and adjust it and this and that and the other. And then they say, okay, great, it's done. And here it is. And they sort of enshrine it. And then nobody ever looks at it again. And it creates yet another layer of tension where people say, well, should we be following the RACI? And what's going on with it? And why do we need to change it now that we've changed the way we're working? And they don't look at it as, to steal one of John Cutler's terms, scaffolding that can be used to start the conversation and then you take it away once people are ready. But they instead looked at it as infrastructure, where it's something that gets installed and it gets followed, except that then it was sort of gathering, it's, not a living document, and it was gathering dust and creating quite a bit of confusion instead of actually adding more clarity. And to all of this, right, there's, whether you use RACI or not, right, the point there was that it was being used as a and Lily, I think this was with your example too. It was being used as a document to kickstart conversations around how we want to work together. And it was essentially just an excuse for relationship building. And this actually, connects back to another one of my hot topics, which is on AI usage. And I wrote this article up for Mind the Product on what AI shouldn't do for you. And one of the things that I'm starting to see is these little bits where AI is getting in the way of relationships, because you sort of use AI and you write up your memo and then you send it to somebody else and they're going to use AI to summarize it. And you're sending, we're sending more and more documents back and forth without actually talking to one another, or, the Slack messages and all of that. And I think that's, again, right, RACI is great if it's encouraging the conversations, if it's about building the relationships between people. And we have to just make sure that we aren't, as product leaders, putting in barriers to encourage teams to not talk to each other, right? To say like, okay, let's just get this document figured out. And then that can suffice for a relationship, right? That can define our relationship, as opposed to let's have a conversation about what kind of relationship we think we should have.
I'm going to despair for the day when someone has a RACI and they put an AI as the accountable individual in it. But going back to my story, this is why that client, that CPTO, is one of my favorites. I just love their approach to this, and the fact that they decided to throw away the prescriptive in favor of the relationships and the building a culture that worked. So people are going to have listened to this entire conversation, and they'll know the good about RACI and the bad and the challenges, but they're still going to go into work the next day and be asked to produce one. So what do you recommend they do in that case? What's a useful way of moving forward when someone says, please just give me my RACI?
So I think the first thing, right, everything I do is the product mindset. And so bring your product mindset to this situation. Your user is saying, I just want a RACI, right? That's their feature request. And what you need to say in return is, okay, what's the real problem that we need to solve here, right? Is the real problem that we are on a time-limited, scope-limited project where the teams are not used to working with one another, and this could help accelerate collaboration? Okay, great, let's do the RACI. If that's not the thing, then you need to figure out, okay, is this a team structure issue? Do we have the right people in place in the right places with the right ability to collaborate and talk to one another? Is it a mission clarity issue? Does everybody actually know what we're trying to achieve and have that same vision in their heads? Or is there a handoff mentality where they're expecting to pass work off between one another without actually collaborate? There's not enough deep enough level of collaboration. And so if you can diagnose which of those three issues, or there are others as well, but those are sort of the top three I've seen, and fix those, the demand for RACI is probably going to go away because you've actually solved the real problem at hand. If you're being forced into creating a RACI, and that is what you must do, don't just make it an exercise of checking off boxes or Xing out others based on who's in which role. Instead, try to add a lot more color to it, right? And use it as that document to have conversations. Oh, you want to be consulted. What do you want to be consulted about? Why do you want to be consulted? Use it actually as a tool to build those relationships, and then make it very clear how long the document's supposed to last for, if it's something that's supposed to be followed, and how much, how tightly, and then just let it go as quickly as possible. But try and make sure that the purpose of the document is clear, that you're really focusing on building relationships. And then I guess my final piece of advice is have low expectations.
I love it. I love that that's your final piece of advice. I do have one more question though. So it feels to me like if RACI is mentioned in the context of a product team, it should be a bit of a red flag for people. They need to kind of really think like, why is this being asked for? There's an element of this, I think, which is tied probably to job descriptions as well, because you're kind of defining what someone is responsible for and what they're not responsible for, and drawing the lines, if you like. What's the correlation, I guess, between a RACI and job descriptions? So should people be worried, or product leaders, should they be worried if people are going, I need a clearer job description? Or is that a kind of more reasonable request than a RACI?
It's a great question, because it does look on the surface like there's a lot of similar things between each of those. But usually the patterns I'm seeing when people are saying, I need a clearer job description, is that there's just too much, there's a lot being expected of them, and usually more hours than there are in the day. And so that's actually a different root cause that's coming up, right? It's a matter of, my scope is too big, right? I am struggling. It's usually I am struggling, or I am being pulled in too many directions. I am not working at my best because of all of this stuff that's being passed over to me. And so asking for a clearer job description is usually then a situation. I don't see that as a cultural red flag in the same way, or a concerning thing, because it's just a form of asking for assistance. It's also not something where you're asking to define your relationship between other people in a contractual fashion, right? It is something where it's defined to you and your job description. I mean, obviously there might be other people in the organization who share your job description, but usually that's not I don't see that being the issue quite as often. or when that does show up of like, we need a job description for what product management should do, it's not that contractual thing. And that can just be let's make sure everybody's on the same page on how that's the question of how do we do product here as a team? What is our philosophy around product? What is our operating model? And so it's a very different challenge than what we see from the RACI conversation. Still a very important conversation to be had and a great one to have, but solving different challenges and different issues.
Mm-hmm. It's funny because as we've been having this conversation, it's reminded me of a few conversations that I have had with various different product teams throughout my career. And my response in that situation of like, this is what we do, this is what they do, has always been like, everybody's a designer, everybody's a product manager, and everybody's an engineer, everybody's a QA person. And it's like, they just happen to do a bit more than everybody else does. And I think having that mentality of really sharing, the responsibility, I guess, of each of those just different functions within a product team, it really changes the mindset of a team when you open it up in that way, because then you're right that it kind of completely shuts down that whole kind of gatekeeping handoff situation and stops people being so protective, which then encourages like so much more collaboration. And I was talking to someone the other day about specialists versus generalists, and he was like, what you need is like, amazing generalists, or and yeah, it's just been so great to have this conversation because it's not something we talk about very often, and I think it is probably more of a problem than we realize it is in lots of product teams.
Lily, so I think that is spot on, because a healthy product team is, and that's why RACI goes, why I spent so much of today talking about going back to the mission, right? Going back to having everybody on the same page about what you're actually trying to achieve. Because the answer is that if you're clear on that, then everybody's going to pitch in wherever work needs to be done. And also just bringing in their best mindset. So one example of a team where there was, one of the most collaborative teams I was on was back at Spot Hero. And there was a particular screen where people were getting confused about an interaction and what was going to be happening if they clicked on if they moved forward. And designer and I went back, and so we came up with a new idea, and we bring it into the team, and we say, okay, here's our new idea, and this is what's going to go on. And I present it, and the QA person, he turns to me and says, Jenny, all you're doing is pushing the problem to the following screen. You're not actually solving this issue. And he was 100% right. And so I said, you are totally spot on. We're gonna remove this ticket. We're going to go back to the drawing board. If anybody has ideas on how to actually fix this problem, please do let us know. But in a RACI world, QA is not going to be responsible for designing new features, right? And is not even going to be, maybe they're on the consulted, but on a lot of team, some places it'd be like, no, QA, they're informed, right, on new product decisions. They're all the way down the list. And I would have lost out. I would have shipped total just garbage if it hadn't been for him stopping me. And I, look back on that moment, just thankful to him all the time for being able to jump in and to tell me, essentially to do my job for me. I needed that day. I was, and then there were other days where we were trying to get a big release out. And so did I roll up my sleeves and start QA, doing manual QA? Absolutely. Would that be on my chart for RACI? No, not as a product manager, but it was what was needed to be done.
I love that story. And yeah, that completely epitomizes like my experiences as well. So you've heard it here first. You are no longer product managers. You are product managers and designers and QA people and engineers. And if you tell me you can't be an engineer, that's rubbish. You just need to speak to your engineers more so that you know enough that you can form a kind of critical eye for things. But
I don't know if I'd go that far, but I'll at least say that you're all on one team together. And
all right, fine. All right, let's. But Jenny, thank you so much for kickstarting this conversation and joining us today. It's been really, really great talking to you.
Yeah, absolutely. If anybody wants to read the whole article, it's at jennywanger.com/RACI. And you can read the article there, sign up for my newsletter, and get more hot takes like this.
And we've got the link in the show notes. So if you didn't get the URL, if you're out in the car or something, then you can click through later.
The Product Experience hosts are me, Lily Smith, host by night and Chief Product Officer by day.
And me, Randy Silver, also host by night. And I spend my days working with product and leadership teams, helping their teams to do amazing work.
Luran Pratt is our producer and Luke Smith is our editor.
And our theme music is from product community legend Arnie Kittler's band, POW. Thanks to them for letting us use their track.